For 80 years, nations agreed that you cannot simply invade another country and remove its leader. That rule ended on January 3, 2026, when American Special Forces dragged Nicolas Maduro from his bed and flew him to a prison cell in Brooklyn. What happens when the most powerful nation on earth decides rules no longer apply? But before we begin, do not forget to subscribe, and if you truly enjoy these videos, please leave a like. Let us begin. What you are about to hear is one of the most stunning military operations in modern American history. A sitting president of a sovereign nation, dragged from his fortified compound in the dead of night by American Special Forces, flown across the Caribbean on a warship, paraded through the streets of New York City in shackles, and all of this happened in less than 3 hours. This is not a story from the Cold War. This is not a declassified operation from decades past. This happened on January 3, 2026, less than 48 hours ago. The world is still processing what it means, and the reverberations will echo for decades to come. In this investigation, we will trace the path that led to this moment. We will examine the 25 years of mounting tension between Washington and Caracas. We will follow the boats that burned in the Caribbean. We will enter the war rooms where generals plotted in secret. We will stand in the streets of Caracas as explosions tore through the night sky. And we will ask the question that haunts international law experts across the globe: was any of this legal? The night Caracas went dark. It was 2 o'clock in the morning local time when the first explosions shattered the silence over Venezuela's capital. January 3, 2026. A Saturday. Most of Caracas was asleep. The city of 3 million souls lay quiet beneath the mountains that ring the valley like ancient sentinels. Street dogs wandered empty avenues. Night shift workers manned their posts. In the presidential compound of Fuerte Tiuna, the largest military installation in Venezuela, guards walked their rounds. Then the sky fell. Residents described the sounds as thunderclaps at first. Then came the unmistakable scream of low-flying aircraft. Then more explosions. And more. At least 7 distinct blasts ripped through the night in rapid succession. The attack lasted less than 30 minutes, but in that half hour, the course of Venezuelan history changed forever. Vanessa Silva, a journalist living near La Carlota military airbase, woke to what she thought was an earthquake. Her apartment shook. Car alarms wailed across the neighborhood. She rushed to her window and saw something she will never forget: flames rising from the airbase. The silhouettes of helicopters cutting through smoke lit skies, tracers arcing through the darkness like deadly fireflies. The targets were precise. La Carlota Air Base, the main aviation hub for Venezuela's military, Fuerte Tiuna, the sprawling fortress complex where President Nicolas Maduro maintained his residence. The port of La Guaira, a critical logistics hub on the Caribbean coast, and communication installations scattered across the capital region. Power went out across southern Caracas almost immediately. Later, President Donald Trump would hint at why. He told reporters the city had gone dark due to a certain expertise that we have. American cyber warfare capabilities, it seems, had joined the assault. The digital attack complemented the kinetic one. Venezuela's air defense systems were disabled before they could respond. Radar installations went blind. Communication networks collapsed. In the basement situation room at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, President Trump watched the operation unfold in real time. Surrounding him sat the architects of this moment: Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Dan Kane. They had planned this for months. They had rehearsed it countless times. Now they watched as years of pressure culminated in 30 minutes of overwhelming force. The helicopters came in low over the Caribbean, flying at 100 feet above the water to avoid detection. The pilots belonged to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the most elite rotary wing unit in the American military. They had flown missions like this before: into Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden, into Syria to kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Now they flew into Caracas to capture a sitting head of state. Behind them came the fighters, F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, F-18 Super Hornets. Over 150 aircraft in total had launched from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere. Bombers flew cover, B-1B Lancers from Dias Air Force Base in Texas. Electronic warfare planes jammed Venezuelan communications. EA-18 Growlers filled the airwaves with confusion. And overhead, watching everything, drones circled silently, including what observers later identified as the secretive RQ-170 Sentinel, a stealth surveillance aircraft rarely seen outside classified briefings. The Venezuelan military never had a chance to respond. By the time commanders realized what was happening, their systems were dark, their communications were scrambled, their air defenses were neutralized. American air power had turned the night sky into a no-fly zone before a single Venezuelan jet could scramble. At the presidential compound within Fuerte Tiuna, Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were awakened by the cacophony. Sources would later reveal that American intelligence had tracked Maduro's movements for months. A CIA team had infiltrated Venezuela in the weeks prior. They monitored his habits, his sleep patterns, his daily routines. They knew exactly where he would be on this particular night. When the Delta Force operators breached the compound walls, they moved with the precision of surgeons. These were not ordinary soldiers. Delta Force, officially known as 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, the most elite direct action unit in the American arsenal. They specialize in missions exactly like this one: high-value target extraction, hostage rescue, counterterrorism. The same unit that killed al-Baghdadi in Syria, the same unit that captured Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Maduro tried to run. Trump would later reveal this detail with evident satisfaction. The Venezuelan president had a safe room, steel-reinforced, designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. But the Americans knew about it. They had built a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound at an undisclosed location. The Delta operators had rehearsed the breach dozens of times. They knew the layout better than Maduro's own guards. He was trying to get into a safe place, Trump told reporters. The safe place is all steel, and he was not able to make it to the door because our guys were so fast. The operators bum-rushed him. That was Trump's word, bum-rushed. Before Maduro could seal himself behind those steel walls, American hands were on him. Within minutes, both Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were in custody, blindfolded, cuffed, hustled toward waiting helicopters. A firefight erupted as the extraction team withdrew. Venezuelan guards who survived the initial assault tried to intervene. One American helicopter took fire. Rounds punched through the fuselage, but the aircraft remained flyable. The Night Stalkers are trained for exactly these conditions. They flew the damaged helicopter out of the combat zone without incident. By 3:29 in the morning Eastern Time, the operation was complete. Maduro and Flores were aboard a helicopter racing toward the Caribbean. Behind them, Caracas burned. Smoke rose from multiple military installations. The acrid smell of explosives hung over the valley. Confused soldiers wandered through wreckage, trying to understand what had just happened. The helicopters delivered their cargo to the USS Iwo Jima, an amphibious assault ship that had been positioned in Caribbean waters as part of the massive American naval buildup. On deck, FBI agents waited to process the most high-profile prisoner the United States had taken since the capture of Manuel Noriega 36 years earlier. To the day, January 3, 1990. The anniversary was almost certainly intentional. Back in Caracas, chaos spread with the morning light. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez appeared on state television. His message was defiant, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. "They have attacked us, but they will not subdue us." He declared a state of external commotion, a legal mechanism that grants emergency powers. But to whom? The president was gone. The chain of command was shattered. Who exactly was giving the orders? Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanded proof of life. She called the capture barbaric, an illegal and illegitimate kidnapping. But even as she spoke, her government was crumbling around her. The Venezuelan Supreme Court would later that day order Rodriguez to assume the presidency, a constitutional formality for a government that had just lost its center of gravity. In the streets of Caracas, the reaction was mixed. In neighborhoods loyal to the Maduro regime, armed militias gathered. They had been told to prepare for American aggression for years. Now it had arrived. But in other parts of the city, the streets remained empty. Many Venezuelans simply did not know what to do. The man who had ruled their country for over a decade was simply gone, vanished into the Caribbean night. In Miami, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Doral, home to the largest Venezuelan diaspora community in America, erupted in celebration. Crowds gathered outside El Arapazo restaurant. Flags waved. The national anthem played. Tears flowed. For millions of Venezuelans who had fled Maduro's authoritarian rule, this was the moment they had dreamed of for years. The dictator was gone. But not everyone celebrated. In Times Square, protesters gathered with signs reading "Hands off Venezuela" and "No blood for oil." Across the country, from Dallas to San Francisco to Washington, D.C., similar demonstrations materialized. For these Americans, the capture of Maduro represented something darker, an illegal act of aggression, a violation of international law, the beginning of another American imperial adventure in Latin America. The sun rose over Caracas on a changed world. The largest American military operation in Latin America since the Panama invasion of 1989 had concluded in under 3 hours. A president had been removed from power by force. The United States had announced it would run Venezuela until a transition could occur. And the international community watched in shock as the rules-based order that had governed relations between nations for decades seemed to crumble in real time. This is the story of how we got here and where we go next. The path to power and 25 years of tension. To understand why American helicopters descended on Caracas in January 2026, you must first understand a man named Hugo Chavez. And to understand Chavez, you must understand oil. Because in Venezuela, oil is everything. It has been everything for a century, and it will remain everything for generations to come. Venezuela sits atop the largest proven petroleum reserves on Earth. Let that sink in. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, not the United States. Venezuela. Roughly 303 billion barrels of crude oil lie beneath Venezuelan soil. 18% of all proven global reserves. For comparison, Saudi Arabia holds about 267 billion barrels. This geological accident of history has shaped every aspect of Venezuelan politics, economics, and international relations since the first major discoveries in the 1920s. For decades, American oil companies dominated Venezuelan production. Standard Oil, Gulf, Texaco, Chevron. They built the infrastructure. They trained the workers. They extracted the wealth. And they sent most of the profits back to corporate headquarters in the United States. Venezuelan elites collaborated eagerly with these arrangements. They grew fabulously wealthy. They sent their children to American universities. They vacationed in Miami. They bought apartments in Manhattan. The Venezuelan people, meanwhile, remained largely poor. Then came Hugo Chavez. He emerged from the Venezuelan military, a paratrooper with charisma that bordered on the messianic. In 1992, he led a failed coup attempt against the government. He was arrested. He spent 2 years in prison, but he used that time to build his movement. When he was released, he pivoted from bullets to ballots. In 1998, he won the presidency in a landslide. Chavez promised a Bolivarian revolution, named after Simon Bolivar, the great liberator of Latin America. He would redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth from the elites to the people. He would challenge American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. He would build a new socialism for the 21st century. And for a time, it seemed like he might actually succeed. The timing was perfect. Oil prices began climbing in the early 2000s. By 2008, crude peaked at $147 per barrel. Venezuela's state oil revenues exploded. Chavez directed billions into social programs called missions. Barrio Adentro brought Cuban doctors into poor neighborhoods. Robinson and Ribas provided literacy training and secondary education. Mercal distributed subsidized food. Vivienda built housing for the poor. The results were dramatic. Poverty rates fell sharply. Literacy improved. Millions of Venezuelans who had been invisible to the state suddenly had access to healthcare and education. For the poorest citizens, Chavez was not just a president, he was a savior. But the revolution came with costs. Chavez nationalized industries far beyond oil. He seized farmland. He expropriated factories. He implemented price controls that distorted markets. He packed the courts. He rewrote the Constitution to remove presidential term limits. He silenced opposition media. Critics were arrested or forced into exile. Democratic institutions eroded year by year. And critically, he made an enemy of Washington. Chavez delighted in antagonizing the United States. He called George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations General Assembly. He forged alliances with Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China. He sold discounted oil to leftist governments across Latin America through a program called Petrocaribe. He expelled American diplomats regularly. He accused the CIA of plotting his assassination. Some of those accusations, it should be noted, may not have been entirely paranoid. In 2002, a coup briefly removed Chavez from power. For 48 hours, a business leader friendly to Washington served as president. Then the coup collapsed. Military loyalists restored Chavez. The Venezuelan government accused the United States of supporting the plotters. Washington denied involvement. But documents released years later showed that American officials had at minimum been aware the coup was coming and chose not to warn Chavez. The relationship never recovered. By the time Chavez died of cancer in 2013, relations between Caracas and Washington were essentially frozen. The two countries maintained formal diplomatic ties, but operated as adversaries in all but name. Enter Nicolas Maduro. Maduro was not Chavez. Nobody could be Chavez. The former bus driver turned union organizer turned foreign minister had none of his predecessor's charisma. Where Chavez was electric, Maduro was wooden. Where Chavez improvised brilliantly, Maduro stumbled through prepared remarks. Where Chavez commanded genuine devotion, Maduro commanded the state apparatus and little else. He won his first election in 2013 by a razor-thin margin. The opposition cried fraud. International observers expressed concerns. But Maduro assumed the presidency and immediately faced a crisis his predecessor never had to confront. Oil prices collapsed. In June 2014, crude oil traded at over $100 per barrel. By January 2016, it had fallen below $30. For a country that derived over 90% of its export earnings from oil, this was catastrophic. The revenue that funded the missions dried up. The subsidies that kept food affordable vanished. The foreign currency needed to import basic goods evaporated. Venezuela spiraled into economic collapse. Hyperinflation reached 1,000,000% annually by 2018. Supermarket shelves stood empty. Medicine became impossible to find. Hospitals performed surgeries without anesthesia. Newborns died in incubators when the power failed. The minimum wage fell to the equivalent of a few dollars per month. The crisis triggered the largest refugee exodus in Latin American history. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled their homeland. They walked across borders into Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru. They boarded boats for Caribbean islands. They claimed asylum in the United States. They scattered across the globe, carrying stories of collapse and desperation. Maduro blamed everyone except himself: American sanctions, Colombian sabotage, an economic war waged by capitalist enemies. He refused to acknowledge that decades of mismanagement, corruption, and socialist economic policies had contributed to the disaster. He printed money recklessly. He seized what remained of private enterprise. He doubled down on the very policies that were destroying his country, and he clung to power by any means necessary. The 2018 presidential election was widely dismissed as fraudulent. Major opposition candidates were banned from running. Others were jailed. The Electoral Council was packed with Maduro loyalists. International observers refused to legitimize the process. Yet Maduro claimed victory and prepared for another term. In January 2019, something unprecedented happened. Juan Guaidó, the young leader of the opposition-controlled National Assembly, invoked constitutional provisions to declare himself interim president. He argued that Maduro's election was illegitimate and therefore the presidency was vacant. The Constitution, he claimed, made the National Assembly president the legitimate successor. The United States immediately recognized Guaidó. So did most of Latin America. So did the European Union. For a dizzying moment, it seemed like Maduro might actually fall. Massive protests filled the streets of Caracas. Military officers defected. Guaidó called for an uprising. But the uprising never came. The military high command remained loyal to Maduro. The regime unleashed security forces against protesters. Dozens died. Hundreds were arrested. Guaidó's support gradually faded as month after month passed without change. By 2022, he had become largely irrelevant. The opposition was divided, demoralized, and defeated. The first Trump administration took a hard line against Maduro. In March 2020, the Department of Justice indicted Maduro on narcoterrorism charges. Prosecutors alleged he had conspired with the Colombian FARC guerrilla group to flood the United States with cocaine. A $50 million bounty was placed on his head. Maximum pressure sanctions targeted the oil industry, freezing Venezuelan assets and prohibiting American companies from doing business with the regime. But Trump lost re-election in 2020. The Biden administration maintained most sanctions while attempting to engage Maduro diplomatically. Officials met with Venezuelan representatives. They negotiated prisoner swaps. They issued limited licenses for oil companies to resume some operations. The hope was that carrots, rather than sticks, might encourage democratic reform. The hope proved naive. Maduro used the negotiations as a delaying tactic. He released a few political prisoners to secure sanctions relief, then arrested new ones. He promised electoral reforms, then reneged. By the time the 2024 presidential election arrived, the Democratic opposition faced the same obstacles as before. The leading candidate, Maria Corina Machado, was banned from running. Her replacement, Edmundo Gonzalez, won according to independent tallies, but the Electoral Council declared Maduro the victor. The international community again refused to recognize the result. The United States declared Gonzalez the legitimate president-elect. But once more, nothing changed. Maduro was sworn in for a third term in January 2025. The opposition published vote tallies showing they had won by a comfortable margin. It made no difference. Power in Venezuela flowed from the barrel of a gun, and the guns belonged to Maduro. Then Donald Trump returned to the White House. The second Trump administration adopted a posture toward Venezuela that made the first term look moderate. Within weeks of taking office, Trump revoked temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans living in the United States. He designated the Tren de Aragua gang as a foreign terrorist organization and claimed without evidence that Maduro controlled it. He revoked oil licenses that Biden had granted. He imposed new sanctions, and he began building an armada. By summer 2025, the largest American naval force to operate in Latin American waters in decades was assembling in the Caribbean. The USS Gerald Ford, America's most advanced aircraft carrier, steamed south from the Mediterranean. Amphibious assault ships carrying thousands of Marines took station. Guided missile destroyers formed a cordon. Submarines lurked beneath the waves. Fighter jets deployed to Puerto Rico. The message was unmistakable. Maduro responded with defiance. He accused the United States of planning an invasion to steal Venezuelan oil. He rallied his supporters. He strengthened ties with Russia, China, and Iran. He prepared for a confrontation that most observers believed would never actually come. They were wrong. The stage was set. 25 years of tension, 2 decades of failed diplomacy, billions of barrels of oil, millions of refugees, hundreds of political prisoners, hyperinflation, starvation, despair. All of it leading inexorably toward the night the helicopters came. The Commodore of the Southern Seas. Before the helicopters came for Maduro, the missiles came for the boats. And before you can understand the boats, you must understand what the Trump administration was building in the Caribbean throughout 2025. Because the capture of a sitting president did not happen in isolation. It was the culmination of a campaign that killed over 115 people before a single American boot touched Venezuelan soil. It began in mid-August 2025. 3 Aegis-guided missile destroyers sailed south toward Venezuela: the USS Sampson, the USS Gravely, the USS Jason Dunham. Each carries enough firepower to devastate a small navy. Their deployment drew immediate attention, but it was only the beginning. Within weeks, the force multiplied. Amphibious assault ships arrived carrying nearly 6,000 sailors and Marines. The USS Iwo Jima, the USS New York, the USS Mesa Verde. These are not patrol vessels. They are designed for projecting power ashore. They carry landing craft. They carry helicopters. They carry Marines trained for combat operations in hostile territory. Their presence in the Caribbean meant one thing: the United States was preparing for something far beyond drug interdiction. Then came the crown jewel. In November, the USS Gerald R. Ford battle group departed the Mediterranean and crossed the Atlantic. The Ford is the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built, displacing over 100,000 tons, carrying over 70 aircraft, accompanied by its own escort fleet of destroyers and cruisers. Its arrival in the Caribbean was a statement that echoed across Latin America. America was not bluffing. F-35 fighter jets deployed to Puerto Rico. Nuclear-powered attack submarines took up positions in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. B-1B bombers flew training missions from Texas, practicing routes that would take them within striking distance of Venezuela. By late December, military analysts estimated that the United States had positioned more firepower near Venezuela than at any time since the Cold War. Trump called it the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. He was probably exaggerating, but not by much. The concentration of American military might was staggering. And Venezuela, with its aging Russian equipment and underfunded military, had no hope of matching it. The official justification was counter-narcotics. The Trump administration claimed it was targeting drug trafficking networks that used Venezuelan territory as a transit point for cocaine bound for the United States. The primary villain in this narrative was a gang called Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua originated in Venezuelan prisons around 2014, named after a railroad that once connected Venezuela's agricultural heartland to the coast. The gang grew rapidly as the Venezuelan state collapsed. They expanded into drug trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, prostitution. By the early 2020s, they had established cells across Latin America and even inside the United States. Immigration and Customs Enforcement blamed them for a wave of violent crime in American cities. Trump designated Tren de Aragua a foreign terrorist organization. This was significant. The label is normally reserved for groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, political organizations that use violence for ideological ends. Applying it to what was essentially a criminal enterprise represented a dramatic expansion of the designation's scope. Critics argued it was legally questionable, but it served an important purpose. It allowed the administration to frame its actions in Venezuela as counterterrorism rather than regime change. And then the killings began. September 2nd, 2025. Trump announced from the Oval Office that American forces had conducted a kinetic strike against a vessel in the Caribbean. The boat had departed from Venezuelan waters. It allegedly carried drugs. The strike killed all 11 people aboard. Trump released video of the attack. Grainy footage shot from a military aircraft, a small speedboat with 4 outboard motors. Then a flash, an explosion. The boat consumed by fire. Bodies visible in the water for a brief moment before the camera panned away. The president called the dead terrorists killed in action. He claimed they were Tren de Aragua members operating under Maduro's control. Secretary of State Marco Rubio suggested the boat had been heading toward Trinidad or another Caribbean island. Experts noted that Venezuela actually plays a relatively minor role in cocaine trafficking to the United States. Most cocaine that reaches American shores comes from Colombia, via the Pacific route, or through Central America. The Caribbean route is secondary at best. None of that mattered. The strikes continued. September 15th. A second boat destroyed. 3 dead. September 21st. A third strike. 3 more killed. September 27th. A fourth attack. 6 dead. The pace accelerated through October and November. Each strike announced on social media by Trump or Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Each accompanied by video showing vessels engulfed in flames. Each justified by claims about drug trafficking that were never substantiated with public evidence. By the end of December, at least 35 strikes had killed at least 115 people across 36 vessels. 11 boats were hit in the Caribbean, 23 in the Eastern Pacific, 2 in unspecified locations. The death toll climbed steadily, and questions began to mount. Were these legal? International law experts were skeptical. The strikes occurred in international waters. The vessels were not engaged in combat against American forces. The people aboard were never given the opportunity to surrender or be detained. They were simply killed. United Nations human rights officials warned that international law does not allow governments to simply murder alleged drug traffickers. The right to life must be respected, they said, even on the high seas. The administration dismissed such concerns. Trump sent a letter to Congress declaring that the United States was in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants. Under the laws of war, he argued, enemy combatants can be killed without warning. By designating drug traffickers as terrorists and declaring an armed conflict against them, the administration claimed legal authority to use lethal force. Critics pointed out several problems with this framework. First, drug trafficking is a crime, not an act of war. Second, the individuals killed had never been charged, tried, or convicted of anything. They were executed on the basis of intelligence assessments that the public was never allowed to see. Third, even in armed conflict, there are rules. You cannot target people who pose no immediate threat. You cannot deny quarter to those who surrender. Several of the strikes reportedly killed survivors who had climbed back onto damaged vessels after an initial attack. The September 2nd strike was particularly controversial. Reports emerged that 2 men survived the initial missile impact. They were seen on surveillance footage, climbing back onto the burning boat. Rather than being rescued or detained, they were killed in a second strike. Defense Secretary Hegseth confirmed this sequence of events. He said the commander on scene made the right call. The administration, he said, had his back. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia was among the most vocal critics. He called the strikes an illegal war. He introduced resolutions in the Senate that would have required congressional authorization for continued military action. Those resolutions failed. Republicans, with their majority, voted them down. But Kaine promised to keep forcing votes. He warned his colleagues that Trump was not bluffing. The president, he said, fully intended to escalate. As fall turned to winter, the escalation came. Trump began hinting at land strikes. The boats were just the beginning, he suggested. The cartels operated from territory inside Venezuela, Colombia, and other countries. Why should they be safe just because they were on land? In late December, Trump gave a radio interview in which he casually mentioned that American forces had knocked out a big plant or facility in Venezuela. The comment received little attention at the time, but it suggested that the United States had already conducted attacks inside Venezuelan territory well before the January 3rd operation. The administration never confirmed or denied what facility had been targeted or when. Maduro watched all of this with growing alarm. He had always claimed that the United States sought his overthrow. Now that claim seemed increasingly credible. The armada off his coast was not there to interdict drug boats. It was there to intimidate him, to pressure him, and ultimately, perhaps, to remove him. In his final days of freedom, Maduro tried to find an off-ramp. On January 2nd, just hours before the operation that would capture him, he appeared on Venezuelan state television. He said he was willing to negotiate with the United States. He offered cooperation on drug trafficking, oil investment, migration. He said he was ready for serious talks. It was too late. The decision had already been made. The forces were already in motion. The weather window was about to open, and the President of the United States had already given the order. Trump would later reveal that he had spoken directly with Maduro in the days before the attack. He told the Venezuelan leader to surrender, to step down, to find his way somewhere else. Maduro apparently considered the offer but ultimately rejected it. Perhaps he did not believe Trump was serious. Perhaps he believed his Russian and Chinese allies would protect him. Perhaps he simply could not imagine an American president actually ordering the military capture of a sitting foreign leader. Whatever his calculation, it proved fatally wrong. The Armada was not a bluff. The boat strikes were not the endgame. They were rehearsals. Each attack tested systems, refined tactics, gathered intelligence. Each killed confirmed that American forces could operate with impunity in waters Venezuela claimed as its own. Each demonstrated that the international community would protest, but ultimately do nothing to stop American military action. By January 2nd, everything was ready. 150 aircraft staged across 20 bases. Delta Force operators briefed and equipped. Night Stalker pilots' flight planned. The target was fixed. The weather was clearing. The Commodore of the Southern Seas had assembled his fleet. All that remained was the final order. Operation Absolute Resolve. The planning began months before the first helicopter lifted off, long before the public knew anything was coming, long before the Armada gathered, long before the boat strikes began. In secure facilities across the United States, a small group of planners had been quietly preparing for what would become Operation Absolute Resolve. The name itself reveals the mindset: absolute. Resolve. No half measures. No diplomatic off-ramps. No backing down. This was to be a demonstration of American power so overwhelming that it would reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere. The planners understood exactly what they were doing, and they believed it was necessary. The operation required coordination between multiple branches of government. The Central Intelligence Agency provided the intelligence foundation. The Department of Defense supplied the muscle. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would handle the legal processing of prisoners. The State Department managed diplomatic preparations. And at the center of it all sat the White House, where President Trump maintained personal oversight of every major decision. The CIA's role cannot be overstated. In October 2025, Trump made an unusual public acknowledgement. He confirmed that he had authorized the agency to conduct covert operations inside Venezuela. The details remained classified, but the implication was clear. American intelligence operatives were already on the ground, laying the foundation for what was to come. Those operatives built what intelligence professionals call a target package. They mapped Maduro's pattern of life. Where did he sleep? Where did he work? How did he travel? Who guarded him? What defenses protected his compounds? They recruited sources inside the Venezuelan government. At least one source, according to reports, held a position close enough to Maduro to track his movements in real time. They deployed technical collection assets, signals intelligence, overhead imagery, electronic surveillance. Every phone call, every radio transmission, every movement of vehicles and personnel around Maduro's locations was monitored and recorded. The picture that emerged was detailed enough to plan a surgical extraction. Fuerte Tiuna, the sprawling military complex south of Caracas, housed Maduro's primary residence. The compound was heavily fortified: walls, guards, multiple layers of security, and critically, a safe room, a hardened shelter with steel-reinforced doors where Maduro could retreat if the compound was breached. The safe room presented a problem. If Maduro reached it before American forces could secure him, the extraction would fail. The solution was speed. The assault team had to move so fast that Maduro would not have time to seal himself behind those steel doors. To achieve that speed, the military built a replica. At an undisclosed location, probably in the United States, but possibly at a forward base in the Caribbean, construction crews erected a full-scale model of Maduro's compound. Every wall, every door, every corridor, the steel safe room itself was recreated with the same materials and dimensions as the original. Delta Force operators rehearsed the breach over and over. They practiced fast roping from helicopters. They practiced explosive entry. They practiced room clearing. They practiced movement through the corridors. They practiced reaching the safe room before anyone inside could close the door. They ran the scenario in daylight and darkness, in clear weather and rain, until every operator could navigate the compound blindfolded. Trump would later describe watching footage of these rehearsals. They actually built a house which was identical to the one they went into, he told reporters, with all the same steel all over the place. He marveled at the speed with which the operators moved through the structure. The planning paid dividends on the night of the actual operation. When Delta Force breached Maduro's compound, they reached him before he could seal the safe room, just as they had practiced, just as they had planned. The air campaign required equally meticulous preparation. Over 150 aircraft would participate: bombers, fighters, electronic warfare planes, intelligence collection platforms, helicopters, drones. Each had to be positioned without alerting Venezuelan defenses. Each had to be assigned specific tasks in a carefully choreographed sequence. The aircraft launched from 20 different locations across the Western Hemisphere. Some flew from continental United States bases. B-1 bombers from Dyess Air Force Base in Texas. Others staged from Puerto Rico. F-35 fighters had deployed there months earlier. Still others launched from ships. The carrier Gerald Ford alone could put over 70 aircraft into the sky. And the amphibious assault ships carried helicopter assets that would prove critical to the extraction itself. The opening phase targeted Venezuelan air defenses, anti-aircraft missile systems, radar installations, command and control nodes. These had to be neutralized before the helicopters carrying the assault team entered hostile airspace. The combination of cruise missiles, precision-guided bombs, and electronic warfare rendered Venezuelan defenses blind and impotent within the first minutes of the attack. Simultaneously, cyber operations disabled Venezuelan communications and power infrastructure. The specifics remain classified. But Trump's comment about the city going dark due to American expertise suggests that Cyber Command played a significant role. Without communications, Venezuelan military commanders could not coordinate a response. Without power, air defense systems went offline. The country was paralyzed even before the physical assault began. Weather delayed the operation multiple times. The Caribbean in winter can be unpredictable. Cloud cover, rain, storms that roll in from the Atlantic. The helicopters needed clear skies and calm winds for the low-altitude flight into Caracas. The pilots would be flying at 100 feet above the ocean surface for much of the approach. At that altitude, even moderate weather becomes dangerous. Trump later confirmed they had planned to execute the operation 4 days earlier. The weather was not perfect, he said. They waited. On New Year's Eve, forces were staged and ready. But conditions had not improved sufficiently. They waited again. Finally, on the night of January 2nd, the weather broke. A window opened. The pilots could navigate the route. The final approval came at 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on January 2nd. Trump gave the order from Mar-a-Lago. His national security team surrounded him. They had been monitoring conditions for days. When the weather window opened, they moved immediately. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, described what followed. Throughout the night, aircraft launched from bases across the Western Hemisphere. They converged on Venezuela from multiple directions. As the night began, the helicopters took off with the extraction force, which included law enforcement officers, and began their flight into Venezuela at 100 feet above the water. The extraction force was a joint team. Delta Force operators provided the assault capability. FBI agents accompanied them to process the arrest. This was important for the legal framing of the operation. The administration wanted to characterize Maduro's capture as a law enforcement action supported by military assets, not a military operation per se. The presence of FBI personnel reinforced that narrative. The helicopters flew through the night. The night stalkers at the controls had trained for exactly this mission profile: low and fast over open water, terrain masking as they approached the coast, navigation by night vision and GPS. No lights, no radio transmissions, complete silence until the moment of contact. As they crossed into Venezuelan airspace, the suppression of enemy air defenses reached its climax. Cruise missiles struck radar installations. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed remaining systems. Fighter jets established air superiority over the target area. Any Venezuelan aircraft that tried to scramble would have been shot down immediately. None tried. At the compound in Fuerte Tiuna, Maduro and his wife were asleep. The CIA's intelligence had confirmed his location. The sources inside the Venezuelan government had tracked his movements throughout the day. He was there, in his bedroom, unaware that American special forces were minutes away. The breach came with explosive speed. Helicopters descended onto the compound. Operators fast roped to the ground. Explosive charges blew through doors and walls. In seconds, Delta Force was inside. Moving through corridors they had memorized. Racing toward the bedroom. Racing toward the safe room. Maduro tried to run. He heard the explosions. He understood immediately what was happening. He sprinted for the steel door that had been designed to protect him from exactly this scenario. He almost made it. "Our guys were so fast," Trump would later say. "He got bum-rushed." Hands seized him. Professional, efficient, overwhelming force. Within minutes, Maduro and Celia Flores were secured, blindfolded, restrained, hustled toward waiting helicopters. Venezuelan guards who tried to intervene were killed or suppressed. One American helicopter took fire during the extraction. It remained flyable. No American personnel died. Several were wounded. All would survive. By 3:29 a.m. Eastern Time, the extraction force was clear of Venezuelan airspace. Maduro and his wife were aboard a helicopter racing toward the USS Iwo Jima. Behind them, Caracas burned. The operation had taken less than 3 hours from the first explosion to the last helicopter crossing the coast. At Mar-a-Lago, Trump watched the final stages unfold. "I watched it literally like you are watching a television show," he would tell reporters. "It was an amazing thing." The president's Truth Social account posted a brief announcement at approximately 4 a.m. Eastern. The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. 25 years of tension, months of planning, days of weather delays, and 3 hours of execution. Operation Absolute Resolve had achieved its primary objective. The president of Venezuela was in American custody. Now came the harder question. What happens next? Delta Force and the Night Stalkers. The men who captured Nicolas Maduro operate in shadows. They do not give interviews. They do not appear at press conferences. Their identities are classified. Their faces are never photographed. Even the unit's official existence was denied by the Pentagon for decades. They are Delta Force, and they represent the sharpest tip of the American military spear. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. That is the formal designation. Created in 1977 by Colonel Charles Beckwith, a combat veteran who had trained with the British Special Air Service and recognized that America needed an equivalent capability, Beckwith envisioned a small unit of supremely skilled operators capable of conducting the most sensitive missions imaginable: hostage rescue, counterterrorism, direct action against high-value targets. Operations so dangerous and so politically charged that failure would be catastrophic. The unit is headquartered at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the same installation that houses much of America's special operations community. But Delta exists in a world apart. Its compound is secured by multiple layers of fencing, surveillance, and armed guards. Even other special operations soldiers cannot enter without specific authorization. The secrecy is by design. Delta's advantage lies not just in skill, but in surprise. The less the enemy knows about their tactics, techniques, and procedures, the more effective they remain. Selection for Delta is brutally difficult. Candidates must already be seasoned special operations soldiers, Army Rangers, Green Berets, sometimes Navy SEALs or other service personnel. They volunteer for assessment, knowing that most will fail. The selection course lasts weeks. Long-distance land navigation through harsh terrain, minimal sleep, heavy loads, psychological pressure designed to identify not just physical capability, but mental resilience. Those who pass selection enter an intensive training pipeline: close quarters combat, marksmanship at levels that would embarrass Olympic shooters, explosive entry, vehicle operations, language training, covert surveillance. The curriculum constantly evolves based on operational lessons. Delta operators are expected to master not just the basics, but to achieve expertise that borders on artistry. The unit's operational history reads like a greatest hits compilation of American military action. Operation Eagle Claw in 1980. The attempted rescue of American hostages in Iran. The mission failed catastrophically in the desert. Helicopters collided. 8 servicemen died. The debacle led to major reforms in special operations and ultimately strengthened the units that emerged from it. Grenada in 1983. Delta operators participated in the invasion, targeting high-value sites and personnel. Panama in 1989. Delta played a key role in operations that led to the capture of Manuel Noriega, Somalia, in 1993. Delta was at the center of the Battle of Mogadishu, the Black Hawk Down incident that killed 18 Americans and shaped military policy for a decade. The global war on terror transformed Delta into something unprecedented. The unit deployed continuously to Iraq and Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. Night after night, operators conducted raids against al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership. They developed a tempo of operations that no other military force on Earth could match. Some operators accumulated thousands of combat missions. The experience they gained cannot be replicated in training. It can only be earned through years of sustained combat. The killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Syria in October 2019 was a Delta operation. Special operators tracked the Islamic State leader to a compound in northwest Syria. They flew deep into hostile territory. They breached the compound. Baghdadi fled into a tunnel and detonated a suicide vest, killing himself and 2 children. But the operation demonstrated Delta's ability to locate and reach the most protected targets on Earth. Now that same capability was turned against Nicolas Maduro. The planning for the Venezuela operation drew on everything Delta had learned over decades of combat. The replica compound allowed operators to rehearse until the movements became automatic. The helicopter insertion replicated tactics refined in countless raids across the Middle East. The speed of the breach reflected lessons learned in thousands of target house assaults. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong at some point in Delta's history. The operators studied those failures and engineered solutions. Flying them into Caracas were the Night Stalkers, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. If Delta represents the finest ground combat force America possesses, the Night Stalkers represent its airborne equivalent. They exist for one purpose: to fly special operations forces anywhere on Earth, in any conditions, and bring them home alive. The regiment was born from the ashes of Eagle Claw. That failed Iran hostage rescue exposed critical weaknesses in American helicopter capabilities. The aircraft were not suited for the mission. The pilots lacked the training for such demanding operations. The coordination between air and ground elements broke down at the worst possible moment. The military resolved never to repeat those errors. Task Force 160 was established in 1981. It was redesignated as the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment in 1990. Based at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the unit flies a fleet of highly modified helicopters: MH-60 Black Hawks, MH-47 Chinooks, MH-6 Little Birds. Each aircraft has been customized with advanced avionics, defensive systems, and weapons that distinguish them from their conventional counterparts. The pilots undergo training that would wash out most military aviators, flying at treetop level in total darkness, navigating through mountain passes with inches of clearance, operating in sandstorms, blizzards, and monsoons. The Night Stalkers' motto is "Night Stalkers do not quit." They live that motto every time they strap into a cockpit. Their operations remain largely classified, but glimpses emerge. The Black Hawk down battle saw Night Stalker aircraft taking devastating fire while continuing to support ground troops. The raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan relied on Night Stalker pilots flying modified stealth Black Hawks deep into Pakistani airspace without detection. When one aircraft crashed in the compound, the crew calmly destroyed the wreckage and boarded a backup helicopter. They completed the mission. For the Venezuela operation, Night Stalker aircraft launched from ships in the Caribbean. The flight profile was demanding: extended overwater navigation at extremely low altitude, terrain masking as they approached the Venezuelan coast, threading through valleys and around obstacles to reach the target compound without being detected by radar. When Venezuelan guards opened fire during the extraction, the helicopters responded with overwhelming force. Door gunners suppressed enemy positions. One aircraft took hits but remained airborne. The pilots continued flying, adjusting for damaged systems, maintaining formation, getting the assault team and their prisoners out of the kill zone and over the water. The professionalism displayed that night represented decades of institutional investment, billions of dollars in training, equipment, and personnel development, thousands of missions that built the institutional knowledge now resident in the force. When critics question whether the Venezuela operation was worth the risk, they should understand that for these operators, the risk was calculated and manageable. They had done harder things before. Still, the operation was not without cost. Several American personnel were wounded. The details remain classified, but Trump confirmed that a couple of guys were hit. All survived. All are reported in stable condition. In the calculus of special operations, this counts as success. No American deaths. Mission accomplished. Prisoners secured. The wounded will receive the Purple Heart. Their names will never be released. They will return to their units when healed and prepare for the next mission. There is always a next mission. For Delta Force and the Night Stalkers, Venezuela was not an ending. It was another chapter in an ongoing story of American power projection. The men who captured Maduro will never be publicly identified. They will never write memoirs. They will never appear on talk shows. They will fade back into the shadows where they have always operated. And when the next impossible mission arises, they will be ready. That is the bargain America makes with its special operations forces. Anonymity in exchange for capability. Secrecy in exchange for effectiveness. The nation asks them to do things that cannot be spoken of in polite company, and they deliver, night after night, year after year, in places most Americans will never know. On the morning of January 3rd, 2026, those men added another president to their collection, Saddam Hussein, captured by forces working with Delta in December 2003. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, killed by Delta in October 2019. Nicolas Maduro, captured by Delta in January 2026. The list grows. The shadows remain. The world reacts. The news spread across the globe like a shockwave. Within hours of Trump's announcement, leaders from every continent were scrambling to respond. What they said revealed as much about the current state of international relations as it did about the operation itself. The world was divided, and the fault lines ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. The United Nations responded with alarm. Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a statement through his spokesperson that pulled no punches. The Secretary General is deeply alarmed by the recent escalation in Venezuela, culminating with today's United States military action in the country, which has potential worrying implications for the region. The statement went further. These developments constitute a dangerous precedent. The Secretary General is deeply concerned that the rules of international law have not been respected. Dangerous precedent. Those words would echo through diplomatic corridors for days. The post-World War II international order rests on certain foundational principles: sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition on the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. The United States had just violated all of them, and the UN's top official was putting that violation on the record. Russia's reaction was swift and furious. The Foreign Ministry called the strikes an act of armed aggression against Venezuela that is deeply concerning and condemnable. Moscow had invested heavily in the Maduro regime. Russian military advisors had trained Venezuelan forces. Russian loans had propped up the economy. Russian oil companies had maintained operations even as Western firms withdrew under sanctions pressure. Now their client state had been decapitated in a single night. The pretexts used to justify such actions are unfounded, the Russian statement continued. Ideological animosity has prevailed over business pragmatism and the willingness to build relationships based on trust and predictability. The language was diplomatic. The meaning was clear. Russia viewed the operation as American imperialism dressed in the clothing of counter-narcotics enforcement. China echoed those sentiments with even sharper language. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed deep shock and strong condemnation. China firmly opposes such hegemonic behavior by the United States, which seriously violates international law, violates Venezuela's sovereignty, and threatens peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean. Beijing had its own interests in Venezuela. Chinese companies held significant stakes in the oil sector. Chinese loans, totaling tens of billions of dollars, remained outstanding. The new reality in Caracas threatened all of it. Iran joined the chorus of condemnation. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei posted on social media that nations must stand firmly against enemies who seek to force their will through false claims. The Foreign Ministry described the attack as a flagrant violation of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Tehran understood the implications. If the United States could remove Maduro with impunity, who might be next? Cuba's response carried particular weight given the island's close relationship with Venezuela. President Miguel Diaz-Canel denounced the criminal attack by the United States and called for urgent international condemnation of what he termed state terrorism. Cuban military and intelligence personnel had operated in Venezuela for years, helping to maintain Maduro's security apparatus. Some analysts speculated that Havana might be the next target. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had hinted as much during the press conference at Mar-a-Lago. Latin America's reaction was mixed but largely negative. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva condemned the operation in stark terms. Bombings on Venezuelan territory and the capture of its president cross an unacceptable line. These acts represent a most serious affront to Venezuela's sovereignty and yet another extremely dangerous precedent for the entire international community. Lula had tried to position Brazil as a mediator in the Venezuelan crisis. The American action had rendered diplomacy irrelevant. Colombia's response was particularly complicated. President Gustavo Petro had been among the first to report the attack, posting on social media that Caracas was being bombed even as explosions continued. He called for emergency meetings of the Organization of American States and the United Nations. Colombia shares a long and porous border with Venezuela. The relationship between the two countries has been fraught for years. But Petro, himself a leftist, viewed the American intervention as a threat to the entire region. Mexico expressed grave concern. President Claudia Sheinbaum called for respect for Venezuelan sovereignty and an immediate halt to military operations. The Mexican government had maintained diplomatic relations with Maduro throughout his tenure, refusing to join other nations in recognizing opposition leaders. Now they watched as the United States simply removed a government it found inconvenient. Not everyone condemned the operation. Argentina's President Javier Milei celebrated what he called excellent news. Milei, a right-wing libertarian who had clashed repeatedly with leftist governments across Latin America, saw Maduro's capture as a victory against socialism. Ecuador's President Daniel Noboa went even further. To all the narco-chavista criminals, your time is coming. Your structure will completely collapse across the entire continent. Israel expressed support for America's strong action. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu commended President Trump for acting as the leader of the free world. Israel and Venezuela had no diplomatic relations under Maduro, who had been a vocal supporter of Palestinian causes. The capture represented an opportunity for realignment. European reactions were cautious. French President Emmanuel Macron called for any transition to be peaceful, democratic, and respectful of the will of the Venezuelan people. He notably did not condemn the American action outright but expressed hope that opposition figure Edmundo González could guide a transition. The French position reflected European ambivalence. Many EU nations had refused to recognize Maduro's presidency but were uncomfortable with the means of his removal. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer declined to say whether the strikes breached international law. He described himself as a lifelong advocate of international law but said he was awaiting the facts. Britain had not been consulted or involved. The careful language suggested London was unwilling to either endorse or condemn its closest allies' actions. Germany's reaction was perhaps the most pointed among Western nations. Roderick Kiesewetter, a prominent member of the conservative Christian Democratic Union, said bluntly that the United States was abandoning the rules-based order that has shaped us since 1945. The coup in Venezuela marks a return to the old U.S. doctrine from before 1940, a mindset of thinking in terms of spheres of influence, where the law of force rules, not international law. Trump, he concluded, is destroying what was left of any trust in the United States. The United Nations Security Council was summoned for an emergency meeting. Colombia, a non-permanent member, formally requested the session. Russia and China backed the call. The meeting was scheduled for January 5th, but everyone understood its limitations. The United States holds a permanent seat with veto power. No resolution condemning American actions could pass. The meeting would be theater. Important theater, perhaps, but theater nonetheless. In American cities, protests erupted. Times Square saw hundreds gather with signs reading, "Hands off Venezuela" and "No blood for oil." Similar demonstrations materialized in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Dallas, Portland, and dozens of other cities. The protesters represented a minority view in America, but their message resonated with critics worldwide who saw the operation as imperialism in its rawest form. Counter-demonstrations also occurred. In Miami, Venezuelan exiles celebrated openly for millions who had fled Maduro's authoritarian rule. This was the moment they had dreamed of. The dictator was gone. Justice, however imperfect, was being served. The emotional scenes in Doral, where the largest Venezuelan diaspora community in America resides, showed the other side of the story. For them, this was liberation, not aggression. The international reaction revealed a world deeply fractured over fundamental questions. What are the limits of state sovereignty? When, if ever, can one nation use force to remove the leader of another? Does the label of narcoterrorism justify military intervention? Does alleged election fraud? Does humanitarian crisis? These questions have no easy answers, The international order built after World War II assumed that the great powers would generally respect each other's spheres of influence, and that military intervention would require broad consensus. That order had been fraying for years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 dealt it a severe blow. Now America's strike on Venezuela delivered another. The precedent worried observers across the political spectrum. If the United States could justify removing Maduro based on drug trafficking charges, what stopped China from claiming similar authority over Taiwan? What prevented Russia from using the same logic against Ukraine's leadership? The framework of international law works only when major powers agree to be bound by it. America had just announced, in the most dramatic way possible, that it would not be bound. The world watched. The world condemned. The world protested. And the world did nothing to stop it. Because in the end, there was nothing the world could do. The United States had the military power to act unilaterally. It had exercised that power. And now, everyone else was left to deal with the consequences. From bus driver to Brooklyn Detention Center, the journey of Nicolas Maduro Moros, from the streets of Caracas to a federal detention center in Brooklyn, spans 6 decades and 2 continents. It is a story of improbable rise and spectacular fall, of a man who went from driving buses through Venezuelan traffic to commanding a nation, and now finds himself in a cell awaiting trial on charges that could put him in an American prison for the rest of his life. He was born in Caracas on November 23, 1962. His father was a union activist, his mother a homemaker. The family was working class. Not poor by Venezuelan standards, but far from wealthy. Young Nicolas attended public schools. He showed no particular academic distinction. What he did show was an interest in politics and labor organizing that would define his trajectory. As a teenager, Maduro became involved in leftist political movements. Venezuela, in the 1970s and 80s, was a democracy dominated by 2 centrist parties that took turns in power. Oil wealth funded social programs, but corruption siphoned much of it away. The left opposition attracted young idealists who believed the system was rigged against ordinary Venezuelans. Maduro was among them. He never attended university. Instead, he went to work as a bus driver for the Caracas metro system. The image would follow him throughout his political career. His opponents mocked him as an uneducated bus driver, pretending to be a statesman. His supporters celebrated the same background as proof that he understood ordinary people's struggles. Both perspectives contained truth. At the metro, Maduro became a union organizer. He rose through the ranks of the Transport Workers Union. He developed skills in mobilization, negotiation, and political maneuvering. He built networks among working-class Venezuelans that would later prove invaluable. And he met the man who would change his life forever. Hugo Chavez burst onto the Venezuelan political scene with the failed coup of 1992. The young military officer went to prison, but emerged as a symbol of resistance to the corrupt establishment. When he won the presidency in 1998, he brought with him a coalition of leftists, nationalists, and populists who shared his vision of revolutionary transformation. Maduro attached himself to Chavez early. He became a loyal foot soldier in the Bolivarian Revolution. His union connections made him useful. His ideological commitment was unquestionable. Chavez rewarded loyalty above all else. Maduro rose steadily through the ranks. By 2006, he had become foreign minister. It was an extraordinary ascent for a man with no diplomatic training or international experience. But Chavez valued political reliability over professional credentials. Maduro traveled the world representing Venezuela. He cultivated relationships with Cuba, Russia, Iran, and other nations aligned against American interests. He developed a reputation as a hardliner who would never compromise with imperialism. When Chavez was diagnosed with cancer, the question of succession became urgent. The president had built his entire movement around his own charisma. There was no obvious heir, but Chavez chose Maduro. He announced his decision publicly, telling Venezuelans that if he could not continue, they should elect Maduro in his place. Chavez died on March 5, 2013. Maduro won a special election the following month by the thinnest of margins. Less than 2% separated him from the opposition candidate Henrique Capriles. The opposition cried fraud. International observers raised concerns. But Maduro took office and began consolidating power. He lacked everything that had made Chavez effective: the charisma, the oratorical skills, the connection with ordinary Venezuelans. Where Chavez could speak for hours and hold crowds spellbound, Maduro stumbled through prepared texts and frequently misspoke. He became a figure of mockery. He claimed to communicate with Chavez's spirit through a small bird that visited him. He blamed economic problems on capitalist sabotage rather than acknowledging policy failures. He surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants. But he understood power. He purged potential rivals. He packed the courts with loyalists. He neutered the legislature when it fell into opposition hands. He built a patronage network that tied the military and security services to his survival. He was not loved, but he was feared. And in the calculus of authoritarian rule, fear suffices. The economic collapse that began in 2014 devastated Venezuela, but did not topple Maduro. He blamed the United States. He blamed Colombia. He blamed the opposition. He never accepted responsibility. When protests erupted, he crushed them. When challengers emerged, he jailed them or drove them into exile. When elections threatened his hold on power, he rigged them. The 2020 indictment by American prosecutors accused Maduro of participating in a narcoterrorism conspiracy spanning decades. According to the Justice Department, he had worked with the Colombian FARC guerrillas to transport cocaine through Venezuelan territory to the United States. He had allegedly received bribes from drug traffickers. He had allegedly used state resources to protect the trade. The charges carried potential sentences of life in prison. Maduro dismissed the indictment as politically motivated fabrication. He pointed out correctly that it came from an administration openly seeking his removal. He noted that the United States had provided no evidence to support its claims. He argued that the real American motivation was Venezuelan oil, not drugs. Many international observers shared his skepticism about the specific allegations, even as they condemned his authoritarian rule. For 6 years, the indictment remained theoretical. Maduro was beyond American reach. He never traveled to countries with extradition treaties. He maintained a security apparatus designed to prevent exactly the kind of operation that ultimately captured him. He believed he was safe. He was wrong. The helicopter that carried him from Fuerte Tiuna deposited him on the deck of the USS Iwo Jima before dawn on January 3rd. The first photograph released by the Trump administration showed him seated, blindfolded, with large headphones over his ears. Sensory deprivation, standard procedure for high-value prisoners. Keep them disoriented. Keep them compliant. Keep them from understanding where they are or what is happening. From the Iwo Jima, he was transferred to an aircraft for the flight to New York. The plane landed at Stewart Air National Guard Base in the Hudson Valley, roughly 60 miles north of Manhattan. Federal agents waited on the tarmac. The transfer from military to civilian custody marked an important transition. Maduro was no longer a prisoner of war. He was a criminal defendant. The motorcade proceeded to Manhattan. By evening, video showed Maduro being walked to the headquarters of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The White House Rapid Response account posted the footage with a 2-word caption: "Perp walked." The former president of Venezuela shuffled down a hallway in shackles. Federal agents in DEA jackets flanked him. The carpet beneath his feet displayed the agency's seal. His final destination was the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, MDC Brooklyn. The facility has housed some of the most notorious defendants in federal criminal history: El Chapo Guzman, Jeffrey Epstein, now Nicolas Maduro. The detention center has capacity and security protocols designed for exactly this kind of high-profile prisoner. Maduro arrived at approximately 8:52 p.m. on Saturday evening. He was processed like any other federal defendant, fingerprinted, photographed, issued prison clothing, assigned a cell. The man who had commanded a nation was now subject to the rules of the Bureau of Prisons. Questions immediately arose about his legal representation. Defending a foreign head of state against American criminal charges is extraordinarily complex. The legal fees alone could run into millions of dollars. But Maduro's assets have been frozen by American sanctions. His access to Venezuelan state funds is now severed. How would he pay for lawyers? Who would even take the case given the political sensitivities involved? Some experts suggested he might need to rely on court-appointed counsel, at least initially. Others speculated that allied nations like Russia or China might find ways to fund his defense. Cuba could potentially provide resources. The logistics remained unclear as Maduro spent his first night in American custody. His arraignment was expected within days. The superseding indictment released by Attorney General Pam Bondi charged Maduro with conspiracy to commit narcoterrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of weapons and destructive devices, and related offenses. His wife, Celia Flores, faced similar charges. Several other Venezuelan officials were named as co-defendants. The indictment alleged that for over 25 years, leaders of Venezuela have abused their positions of public trust and corrupted once legitimate institutions to import tons of cocaine into the United States. Maduro was described as being at the forefront of that corruption. The document accused him of partnering with drug traffickers and narco-terrorists to transport thousands of tons of cocaine to the United States. Maduro has consistently denied all such allegations. He maintains that the charges are fabricated pretexts for American imperialism. He points to Venezuela's oil wealth as the real motivation for American hostility. He has called the indictment as false as the weapons of mass destruction claims that justified the Iraq War. The trial, whenever it occurs, will be unprecedented. A former sitting president of a sovereign nation, captured by American military force, tried in an American court for crimes allegedly committed while in office. The legal complexities are staggering. The political implications are profound. The historical significance is undeniable. From bus driver to president to prisoner, the arc of Nicolas Maduro's life has taken him from Caracas traffic jams to the heights of power to a cell in Brooklyn. Whatever happens in the courtroom, that journey is already complete. The man who once commanded millions now commands nothing. The man who once moved freely through palaces now cannot leave a cell without permission. History will judge whether justice was served or merely manufactured. For now, Maduro waits, and the world watches. The oil beneath the chaos. Strip away the rhetoric about drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. Set aside the debates about democracy and human rights. Look past the geopolitical chess games between great powers. And you will find, as you always do in Venezuela, oil. 300 billion barrels of it. The largest proven reserves on the planet, worth trillions of dollars at current prices. And now, for the first time in decades, potentially accessible to American companies. President Trump made no effort to hide this dimension of the operation. At his press conference at Mar-a-Lago, he spoke about oil repeatedly. We are going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. He promised that the biggest beneficiary would be the people of Venezuela. But he also made clear that America intended to profit. In terms of other countries that want oil, we are in the oil business, Trump declared. We are going to sell it to them. The statement was remarkably blunt. The United States had just conducted a military operation to remove a foreign leader, and the president was openly discussing plans to exploit that country's natural resources. To understand why Venezuelan oil matters so much, you must understand its unique characteristics. Most of Venezuela's reserves consist of extra heavy crude. This is not the light, sweet oil that flows easily from wells in Saudi Arabia or Texas. Venezuelan crude is thick, viscous, and laden with impurities. It requires specialized refineries to process. It commands lower prices on international markets. But there is so much of it that even discounted prices translate to enormous value. For most of the 20th century, American companies dominated Venezuelan oil production. Standard Oil and its successors, Gulf, Texaco. They built the wells, the pipelines, the refineries. They trained Venezuelan workers. They extracted billions of barrels, and they sent most of the profits back to the United States. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. The state company Petróleos de Venezuela, known as PDVSA, took control of all production. American companies were compensated and pushed out, but the relationship between Venezuelan oil and American markets remained strong. Geography made it so. Venezuela sits just a few days' shipping time from Gulf Coast refineries. Those refineries were specifically configured to process heavy Venezuelan crude. The match was nearly perfect. Hugo Chavez complicated everything. He did not trust foreign companies, especially American ones. He accused them of exploiting Venezuelan resources for the benefit of shareholders in New York rather than citizens in Caracas. He raised taxes on oil operations. He demanded renegotiation of contracts. He required foreign companies to become minority partners in joint ventures controlled by PDVSA. Some companies accepted the new terms. Chevron remained. Others refused and were expropriated. ExxonMobil lost billions in assets. ConocoPhillips filed international arbitration claims. The exodus of Western expertise contributed to a steady decline in Venezuelan production. PDVSA, once one of the most capable oil companies in the world, became increasingly dysfunctional under political management. Production that had exceeded 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s fell to roughly 2.5 million by the time Chavez died. Under Maduro, the collapse accelerated. Mismanagement, corruption, sanctions, lack of investment. By 2020, Venezuela was producing less than 500,000 barrels per day, a catastrophic decline for a country whose economy depended almost entirely on oil exports. American sanctions played a significant role. The Trump administration's first term imposed sweeping restrictions on Venezuelan oil. Companies were prohibited from doing business with PDVSA. Venezuelan assets in the United States were frozen. Tankers carrying Venezuelan crude were blacklisted. The stated goal was to pressure Maduro into leaving power. The actual effect was to devastate what remained of Venezuelan oil production. The Biden administration loosened some restrictions. Chevron received a license to resume limited operations in 2022. Other companies received individual permissions. Oil began flowing again, albeit at reduced levels. Venezuela remained far from its historical production capacity. Then Trump returned to office. Within months, he revoked Chevron's license. He reimposed the harshest sanctions. He announced a blockade of Venezuelan oil tankers. And he began seizing vessels carrying Venezuelan crude in international waters. The message was clear. Venezuelan oil would not reach markets without American permission. Now that Maduro is gone, the question becomes, what happens next? Trump has signaled his intentions clearly. American oil companies will enter Venezuela. They will spend billions to rebuild the shattered infrastructure. They will restore production to historical levels or beyond, and they will profit handsomely from the effort. The technical challenges are immense. Venezuela's oil fields have suffered from years of neglect. Wells need to be reworked or replaced. Pipelines need repair. Refineries need modernization. The electrical grid that powers pumping stations barely functions. Some estimates suggest that restoring full production could take a decade and cost tens of billions of dollars. But the prize is worth the investment. At current prices, Venezuela's proven reserves are worth over $20 trillion. Even capturing a fraction of that value would represent an enormous windfall for whoever controls access. American companies that spent the past 2 decades locked out of Venezuela are now positioning to rush back in. The geopolitical implications extend beyond economics. China has invested heavily in Venezuelan oil. Chinese loans, totaling tens of billions of dollars, were supposed to be repaid with oil shipments. Russian companies hold stakes in Venezuelan fields. If American firms displace these competitors, it would represent a significant shift in global energy politics. Trump's vision goes further still. He has spoken of Venezuela becoming a major supplier to Europe, which has struggled to replace Russian energy since the invasion of Ukraine. Venezuelan heavy crude could theoretically fill some of the gap left by sanctioned Russian exports. The infrastructure to make this happen does not currently exist, but with sufficient investment, it could be built. Critics point out the troubling implications of this framing. The United States conducted a military operation to remove a foreign leader. The president immediately began discussing plans to exploit that country's natural resources. How is this different from 19th century colonialism? How is it different from the resource wars that have destabilized regions across the global south? The administration's defenders argue that Venezuela's oil belongs to the Venezuelan people. Maduro was stealing it for himself and his cronies. Restoring production will benefit ordinary Venezuelans through jobs, tax revenue, and economic development. The oil companies are not colonizers, but investors whose expertise Venezuela desperately needs. Both arguments contain elements of truth. Both obscure the fundamental reality that power determines who controls resources. The United States has the power to reshape Venezuela's oil industry in its preferred image. Whether it will use that power wisely remains to be seen. One thing is certain. The next chapter of Venezuelan history will be written in petroleum, just as every previous chapter has been. The curse of oil wealth is that it attracts attention from those who want it. Venezuela has that wealth in abundance, and the strongest nation on earth has just demonstrated its willingness to use force to access it. The wells will flow again. The refineries will hum. The tankers will carry crude to waiting markets. The only question is who profits. And that question, for the moment, has an American answer. The question of legality. Was it legal? The question haunts every analysis of Operation Absolute Resolve. International law experts have been debating furiously since the first explosions lit up the Caracas sky. American constitutional scholars are equally divided. The answers depend on which legal framework you apply, and the frameworks themselves are contested. Start with international law. The United Nations Charter, signed by virtually every nation on Earth, including the United States, establishes clear rules about the use of force. Article 2, Paragraph 4 prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There are only two recognized exceptions: self-defense under Article 51 and authorization by the Security Council under Chapter 7. The United States did not claim self-defense. Venezuela had not attacked American territory or forces. The boat strikes in the months preceding the operation occurred in international waters, not American territory. There was no imminent threat that would trigger the self-defense exception. The United States did not seek Security Council authorization. Such authorization would have been impossible to obtain. Russia and China hold permanent seats with veto power. They would never approve military action against an allied government. The administration did not even try. So what legal justification did the United States offer? The answer is creative, contested, and potentially revolutionary in its implications. The administration framed the operation as law enforcement, not war. Maduro had been indicted by a federal grand jury in 2020 on narcoterrorism charges. A warrant existed for his arrest. The United States was simply executing that warrant. The military provided support to law enforcement officials who made the actual arrest. FBI agents accompanied Delta Force operators for precisely this reason. Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized this framing at the press conference. At its core, this was an arrest of two indicted fugitives of American justice. The Department of War supported the Department of Justice in that job. He acknowledged broader policy implications but insisted the operation was fundamentally a law enforcement action. Critics find this argument unpersuasive. International law does not permit one nation to enter another's territory to arrest its citizens, let alone its head of state, without consent. The existence of an American indictment does not create jurisdiction over a foreign leader in his own country. If it did, any nation could indict any other nation's leader and then invade to execute the arrest warrant. The implications would be chaos. The administration offered a secondary argument. Maduro was not the legitimate president of Venezuela. The 2024 election was fraudulent. The real winner was Edmundo González. The United States recognized González as president-elect. Therefore, Maduro was merely a criminal occupying the presidential palace. His removal did not constitute regime change because he was never the legitimate regime. This argument has some diplomatic backing. Dozens of countries refused to recognize Maduro's election victory. The evidence of fraud was substantial. But international law does not generally condition sovereignty on the legitimacy of elections. Many governments around the world hold power through dubious means. The principle of sovereignty applies regardless. Constitutional questions are equally thorny. The United States Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. The President, as Commander-in-Chief, has authority to direct military operations. But the boundary between these powers has been contested since the founding. The War Powers Resolution, passed in 1973 over President Nixon's veto, attempted to clarify the relationship. It requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing American forces into hostilities. It limits military engagement to 60 days without congressional authorization, with a 30-day withdrawal period. The Trump administration did notify Congress, but only after the operation began. The Gang of Eight, senior congressional leaders with Intelligence Committee responsibilities, received briefings Saturday morning. Several legislators complained they had not been consulted in advance. But the administration argued that operational security required secrecy. Leaks could have endangered American forces. More fundamentally, the administration disputed that the War Powers Resolution applied at all. This was law enforcement, not hostilities. The military supported an arrest operation. No ongoing conflict required congressional authorization because the operation was a discrete event, not a war. Senator Tim Kaine rejected this reasoning entirely. There is no legal justification in the Constitution, in the history of the Constitution, or in American law that would authorize the president to wage war, to depose President Maduro, and seize its oil and run the country of Venezuela without coming to Congress. He called the operation an illegal war and pledged to force repeated votes on war powers resolutions. The administration's supporters invoked precedent. President Obama ordered the capture of Anas al-Libi, an al-Qaeda operative from Libya in 2013 without congressional authorization. That operation was characterized as law enforcement. Why should Maduro be different? Critics note important distinctions. Al-Libi was a terrorist, not a head of state. He was captured from Libya during a period of civil war when no effective government existed. The operation did not involve airstrikes on military installations. The scale and nature of the Venezuela operation far exceeded anything comparable in recent history. Some legal scholars offered a more fundamental critique. The entire framework of international law depends on major powers agreeing to follow it. When a dominant power decides to ignore the rules, there is no enforcement mechanism. The United Nations cannot compel the United States to do anything. International courts have no jurisdiction over American leaders. The rules exist only to the extent that powerful nations choose to obey them. The United States has chosen not to obey. Or, more precisely, the Trump administration has chosen to reinterpret the rules to permit what it wanted to do anyway. Whether that interpretation gains acceptance depends on whether other nations acquiesce. So far, they have protested but taken no action. Protest without consequence is simply noise. What precedent does this set? Senator Mark Warner posed the question directly. If the United States asserts the right to use military force to invade and capture foreign leaders it accuses of criminal conduct, what prevents China from claiming the same authority over Taiwan's leadership? What stops Vladimir Putin from asserting similar justification to abduct Ukraine's president? The answer is nothing except the balance of military power. China could attempt to capture Taiwan's leaders, but would face American opposition. Russia could attempt to capture Zelensky, but would face NATO resistance. Venezuela had no such protection. It was weak. It was isolated. It had alienated potential defenders. And so, it was vulnerable. International law, in this reading, is not law at all. It is a description of norms that powerful states follow when convenient and ignore when not. The Venezuela operation reveals the nakedness of this reality. The United States did what it wanted because it could. The justifications offered are post hoc rationalizations, not genuine legal constraints. This is a dark interpretation. It suggests that the international order is fundamentally anarchic, governed by force rather than rules. Many scholars resist this conclusion. They argue that norms matter, even when violated. They point to reputational costs the United States will bear. They note that future cooperation becomes harder when trust erodes. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the Venezuela operation will prove to be an aberration, a one-time event that does not reshape international relations. Or perhaps it marks the beginning of a new era in which powerful states act unilaterally and justify it afterward. The courtroom will provide one forum for these debates. Maduro's lawyers will certainly challenge the legality of his capture. They will argue that evidence obtained through illegal seizure should be excluded. They will claim violations of international law deprive American courts of jurisdiction. Whether such arguments succeed is uncertain. American courts have historically been reluctant to second-guess executive decisions about military operations. The historical verdict will take longer to render. Generations of scholars will study Operation Absolute Resolve. They will compare it to the Panama invasion, the Iraq War, and other American interventions. They will debate whether it served American interests, promoted stability, or unleashed chaos. For now, the question remains open. Was it legal? The honest answer is that it depends on who you ask. And in a world where power trumps law, that may be the only answer available. What comes next? The dust has not yet settled over Caracas. The fires still smolder at Fuerte Tiuna. The streets remain tense with uncertainty. And the most important questions about Venezuela's future remain unanswered. What happens now? Who governs? How does a nation recover from having its president kidnapped by a foreign power? Trump's answer was characteristically blunt. "We are going to run the country." He said it at his press conference, with no apparent irony. The United States would administer Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition could occur. He did not specify what that transition would look like or how long American control would last. The statement raised immediate alarms. Running a foreign country is colonialism by another name. Even American allies expressed discomfort. The United Nations Secretary General called it a dangerous precedent. Critics compared it to the Iraq War, where American promises of quick transition gave way to years of occupation and chaos. The administration has offered few details about its plans. Secretary of State Rubio said decisions would be made in coordination with Venezuelan stakeholders. Defense Secretary Hegseth emphasized that American forces were prepared for whatever came next. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Kane noted that a second wave of attacks was ready if needed. The vagueness seemed deliberate. Perhaps the administration itself did not know what came next. Inside Venezuela, the situation is confused. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has nominally assumed the presidency. The Supreme Court ordered her to take power to ensure administrative continuity. But Rodriguez faces impossible circumstances. The man who appointed her is in an American jail. The military that protected the regime just witnessed its headquarters bombed. The international community is watching to see which direction she moves. Rodriguez's initial statements were defiant. She called Maduro's capture barbaric and demanded his release. She insisted he remained the only legitimate president. She suggested Venezuela would defend its sovereignty and resources. But defiance without power is empty, and Rodriguez may not have the power to resist American pressure. The opposition presents another possibility. Maria Corina Machado emerged as the face of resistance to Maduro's authoritarianism. She was banned from running in the 2024 election, but remained the most popular political figure among Venezuelans who opposed the regime. She was spirited out of the country to accept the Nobel Peace Prize in December. Her current whereabouts are unknown. Machado has expressed support for Trump's approach to Venezuela. She welcomed American pressure on Maduro. She declined to rule out military intervention. When the operation occurred, she issued a statement declaring that the time for freedom has come. She called for Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate who claims to have won the 2024 election, to be recognized as the legitimate president. Trump's reaction to Machado was lukewarm. He described her as a very nice woman, but said she lacks support and respect within the country. The assessment seemed designed to lower expectations that she would lead the transition. Perhaps the administration prefers a different figure. Perhaps they have not decided. The uncertainty itself creates instability. Gonzalez represents another option. The United States recognized him as the winner of the disputed election. He has been living in exile in Spain. He could theoretically return to Venezuela and claim the presidency. But his actual base of support is unclear. He was a compromise candidate chosen when Machado was banned. His personal following is limited compared to hers. The military remains the decisive institution. Venezuela's armed forces have historically determined who holds power. They backed Chavez against the 2002 coup attempt. They backed Maduro through years of economic collapse and political crisis. They did not resist the American operation, but that was because they were overwhelmed, not because they defected. Many senior officers are implicated in the drug trafficking and corruption that the United States claims to be fighting. They have reason to fear American justice. They have reason to resist any transition that might expose them to prosecution. Whether they will accept a new government depends largely on guarantees about their fate. Some analysts predict fragmentation. Different military factions might align with different political figures. Regional strongmen could emerge. The country could descend into something resembling civil war, or at minimum, prolonged instability. Venezuela has never experienced this kind of power vacuum. The institutions that might manage a peaceful transition have been hollowed out by years of authoritarian rule. The humanitarian situation adds urgency. Venezuela's economy was already in crisis. The attack disrupted what remained of functioning infrastructure. Power outages spread beyond the initial cyber attacks. Supply chains that were barely functioning have been further damaged. The millions of Venezuelans who depend on government food distribution face uncertainty about whether those programs will continue. The refugee crisis could intensify. Over 7 million Venezuelans have already fled the country. If instability worsens, more will follow. Colombia, which shares a long border with Venezuela, has already deployed security forces to prepare for potential influxes. The region cannot easily absorb another wave of displacement. American oil companies are reportedly preparing to enter Venezuela as soon as conditions permit. Teams are being assembled. Investment plans are being drafted. The infrastructure assessment has already begun. But operating in an unstable environment is risky. Companies need security guarantees that may not be available. The timeline for restoring oil production depends on political conditions that remain uncertain. China and Russia face difficult choices. They have invested heavily in Venezuela. Those investments are now threatened. But neither has the power to reverse what the United States has done. They can protest. They can impose costs through other channels. They can support resistance elements within Venezuela. But direct confrontation with America over a country half a world away from Beijing and Moscow is not in their interest. The broader implications for international relations will unfold over years. The United States has demonstrated a willingness to use overwhelming military force to remove governments it opposes. Other nations will adjust their calculations accordingly. Some may seek American protection more urgently. Others may accelerate efforts to develop deterrent capabilities. The nuclear question is particularly sensitive. Nations that possess nuclear weapons are essentially immune from the kind of operation conducted against Venezuela. Nations that do not possess them may reconsider their positions. Cuba is watching with particular anxiety. Rubio hinted that Havana should be concerned. The Cuban government has long supported Venezuela. Cuban intelligence and military personnel operated alongside Venezuelan counterparts. If the United States is willing to strike Venezuela, Cuba could be next. The island has few defenses against American military power. Only the memory of the Bay of Pigs disaster and the reluctance to repeat that fiasco provide some measure of protection. Iran is also recalculating. The Islamic Republic has cultivated ties with Venezuela as part of its broader strategy of countering American influence. Those ties are now severed or at minimum severely disrupted. Tehran must wonder whether it could face similar pressure. The American military cannot easily reach Iran as it reached Venezuela. But the willingness to act unilaterally against perceived enemies has been demonstrated. For Venezuela itself, the next weeks and months will determine whether this moment becomes liberation or disaster. The optimistic scenario envisions a peaceful transition. A legitimate government emerges. International recognition follows. Aid flows in. Oil production resumes. The economy stabilizes. Refugees return. Democracy takes root. The pessimistic scenario is darker. No legitimate government emerges. Factions compete for power. Violence spreads. The economy collapses further. More refugees flee. American forces are drawn deeper into a quagmire. Venezuela becomes another Iraq or Afghanistan, a country where American intervention creates more problems than it solves. The truth will likely fall somewhere between these extremes. Transitions are messy. They take time. They involve compromises that satisfy no one. Venezuela has advantages that Iraq and Afghanistan lacked. A more educated population, a more developed infrastructure despite recent decline, a clearer path to economic recovery through oil. But it also has disadvantages. Deep political polarization, institutions weakened by years of abuse, a military with its own interests to protect. History will judge Operation Absolute Resolve by its consequences. If Venezuela emerges as a stable democracy with a functioning economy, the operation will be remembered as a success, despite its questionable legality. If Venezuela descends into chaos, the operation will be remembered as another American blunder, another intervention that made things worse. We do not yet know which verdict history will render. We only know that the verdict depends on choices yet to be made by Venezuelans who must find a way forward, by Americans who must decide how deeply to involve themselves, by the international community that must determine whether to help or hinder. The helicopters have left. The fires are dying. The president is in a cell in Brooklyn, and a nation of 30 million souls waits to learn what future awaits them. The story of Venezuela is far from over. In many ways, it is just beginning.